Welcome to the Center Collaborative, Creative Solutions in Behavioral Health and Criminal Justice, brought to you by the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, which is also known as the Center. We at the Center are all about solutions. Our job in Oregon is to facilitate improvement of the system so behavioral health and criminal justice can work better together to engage people in treatment while promoting public safety. I am your host, Chris Thomas. I hold a master's degree in clinical psychology and have focused on the intersection between behavioral health and criminal justice for 20 years. Over 7 of those years were behind the walls of a maximum security prison. During this podcast, you will have the opportunity to sit in on real, in-depth conversations with experts about complex topics in a way that is both fascinating and digestible. We will focus not just on what is wrong with the system, but what is going right and how we can work together to evolve. This podcast is a conversation in a series of conversations where we touch on people's legal rights and their options related to seeking medical care. Since our conversations are intended for informational and educational purposes only, they are not a substitute for or a reason to delay seeking professional legal or medical advice. On today's episode, we have Captain Clint Riley, Lane County Jail Commander, and Sergeant Chuck Hardy, one of the Lane County Jail's mental health sergeants. Captain Riley and Sergeant Hardy joined me to talk about the expanded criteria for programming the Lane County Jail has developed to reach and engage adults in custody, AICs, who traditionally are difficult to engage in treatment. The treatment available at the Lane County Jail has made significant differences with not only the behavior of AICs in jail, as well as supports pro-social behavior when AICs return to the community. Captain Riley and Sergeant Hardy talk about engaging adults in custody on a human level with accountability and expectations for behavior in place, and how this results in AICs being better neighbors when they release back into the community. I learned so much during my conversation with Captain Riley and Sergeant Hardy. I think you will too. Welcome to our conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Captain Riley and Chuck. It is so great to have you both with us here today.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Well, I'm thrilled to finally get you on the podcast. Every time I talk to you, you're always doing something new, and I'm always impressed by your new programs. So I thought it might be helpful for our listening audience to start off talking about the programming at the jail, because I know you're always coming up with new things.
The programming in the jail's evolved over the last 5 to 7 years. We have 382 jail beds. We started to see a real rise in behavioral health disorders and substance use disorders over the last 5 to 7 years. And we took a different approach to manage our population. We started bringing in more mental health and doing more programming and creating housing areas where adults in custody were coming out getting programming. And our hopes was to get better behavior from the folks that were in here and also provide them treatment to help them with some of their disorders. And so we've just slowly over that time frame started bringing in mental health and adding programming, then taking some of our most disruptive folks that we had in here that we had a hard time managing, putting them in group therapy housing areas, and we've seen a lot of success with their behavior improving and just a lot of improvement overall. Talking with the folks that are in the programs, you're seeing them getting new skill sets that they've never had before, coping skills, ways to deal with anxiety and depression, and then really getting into what's going to help them go on in the future. But it also helps us here as we manage them every day in the facility. Our use of forces go down, misconduct reports, makes it for a better environment for our staff to work in. Yeah, it's been great.
I know that Lane County Jail even takes into account the little things beyond the programming, like in the behavioral health unit, folks actually have a light switch that they can turn on and off for the light in their cell, which is not something that happens in typical jail cells. And I'm wondering if you want to talk about just those touches as well.
One of our most secure housing areas that was built in the late 90s when we added on to the jail we took control of all that stuff. Light switches, there's no outside windows in those cells. We were watching some of our folks deteriorating really bad in those areas. And if you talk to the adults in custody population, they would tell you what was important to them, a window to look outside, and they can control their own light switch. In our housing areas that were built in the 70s, that's what they have, outside windows and light switches. So really to move the wellness program to where it's at today came from just talking to adults in custody and them telling us that was what was important to them. And that's why we moved it to where it's at today. That's where we got the idea to do it, and then just working in here for years, knowing when there's no window to look outside and the hum of a fluorescent light in your cell all day long and no way to turn that off, and someone suffers from mental health disorders, that was actually deteriorating to them.
I can also imagine just the difference of having that slight feeling of control on having a light switch on and off makes a difference for folks as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm wondering, Sergeant Hardy, if you want to talk about the work that you do as the mental health sergeant and how important it is in these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you indicated, we're very fortunate to have another mental health sergeant that we brought on board. The amount of workload is certainly there, so it warranted it. And we're really excited to have that occur for our facility. I would say everything starts with our multidisciplinary team. We meet weekly. We evaluate the population that we have in the building. We look at people who are on suicide watch, who are in our special management unit. We have a population of some that may be transgender. And so we always want to make sure we're looking at the needs of the AICs we have in the building. And how do we keep the building as safe as possible, the AIC safe and our staff safe? So at our multidisciplinary team meetings, we look at this population that might be a little bit more acute, that are on our radar, and we create management plans. And then we go from there. And we can at any time pull that team together. But typically we meet on Thursdays. But if we need to, we can pull that team together and really be able to be responsive to the needs of the adults in custody that we have.
Sergeant Hardy, I'm wondering if you can talk about who is on that team.
Yeah, great question. We have our new mental health sergeant is also our tactical or SORT team sergeant. So he was in our security office. So we had somebody with a security background, and then myself as the mental health sergeant. And then we have our mental health team. We have the ability to have medical there. And so we typically don't have medical there every meeting, but they can be a phone call away. Again, multidisciplinary team, it's exactly what it sounds. A lot of disciplines in the room. We have one of our population management team deputies there. So we're able to pool all of that experience and make the best decisions for everybody in the building, like I said, on a weekly basis or on a daily basis as needed.
And when you are staffing a case, without giving any details, of course, but what type of situations are you talking about? What type of interventions?
We have people in the building who maybe typically cycle on and off suicide watch. We have one AIC in the building, as an example, who has a propensity to eat pencils. So we have created a management plan because we want them to still be proactive. We want them to still utilize some of the tools that we have, coloring pages and puzzles, but they're eating pencils and then having to transport them back and forth to the emergency room per our medical's request. What we've done is we've gone to a washable crayon that if they do write on the walls, it's easy to come off. It's non-toxic. If your 4-year-old ate it, we wouldn't be concerned. So we have to look at how can we allow this person still the ability to have something that allows them to stimulate their mind and keep them occupied while making sure that they're safe and the facility's safe as well.
It's outside the box thinking of the traditional corrections paradigm, for sure. And I'm wondering, Captain Riley, if you want to talk about that a little bit, what the population in Lane County Jail used to look like versus the population now, and how that has really required y'all to really change your thinking and how you work with folks, but also the programming that is available at the jail.
Absolutely. I think back to earlier when I was answering the questions about our program. When we first started this program, we called it the socialization program. The goal was to socialize folks, and in return, we knew we'd probably get better behavior. At least some of us thought that. Not everybody thought that. But when you lock somebody down for long periods of time, and traditionally in corrections, you have to earn something. You have to be well behaved, and the classification process is if you start out at a high classification, good behavior will move you down. And lower classification, you get more privileges. With our wellness program and our socialization program, we took some of our highest classification disruptive folks, gave them what would be perceived as privileges and time out, along with group therapy, yoga, and different stuff with our medical program, knowing that that would probably get better behavior from them. If you lock someone down over time, they just continue to deteriorate. So we're actually providing people privileges before they've earned it, which traditionally in a jail doesn't work like that. And we went from socialization was to bring folks out and actually have them have a meal together, break bread together, have a community environment, socialize with one another, and see if we can't get better behavior there. When that worked, we decided to move the socialization program up to the third floor where it's at now, where it was lighter, brighter. They had their own light switches. And then we eventually decided to change the name of the program to the wellness program. And so overall, we're seeing folks in that program years ago would have been very difficult to manage in here, doing very well up there, and their behavior is appropriate. And they're sitting in groups talking about it. It's been pretty neat to watch it evolve over time.
For our listening audience, because we have a wide range of listening audience, so let's just take a moment to talk about classification and privileges and the magic that happened that seems somewhat counterintuitive when you first think about it.
Yeah.
So my understanding of classification and custody is the higher someone's classification, they're considered more of a risk, and so they have less privileges traditionally, and the better behavior that someone engages in, their classification gets lower. So it's a little bit different. Most folks would think a high classification, you would think high privileges, but it's flipped like that in a correction environment. Is that right?
Yeah. And you look at two things typically with classification. You look at the charges someone comes to jail for, and then you look at their institutional behavior. And someone might come in for a pretty serious felony charge. They're going to be a high classification. Now you're monitoring their institutional behavior over time to see if you can lower their classification levels based on their behavior. Your charge will get you originally classified based on what your danger to the facility is perceived to be. And in these particular cases, most of the folks we had, their mental health disorders or their substance use disorders, their behavior was always poor, which kept their classification high. And some of them came in on pretty low-level crime. Low-level crime, high classification, and their behavior just got worse and worse and worse when you take away privileges and lock them down more. So the goal was to get them out of their cells and get them doing things, get them in group therapy situations, and see if that would improve their behavior. I've grown up working in jails and prisons. If you lock someone down and you don't give them anything, the staff that work in the facilities become the entertainment for the folks that live in there. And it just becomes a very difficult place to work in when that's the environment. And so when you get somebody out and there's stuff for them to do, they focus less on staff and more on the activities that are going on.
And while it seems somewhat counterintuitive for our listening audience, from what folks traditionally think of within a jail, they think, well, if we lock somebody in the room and take all their privileges away, then suddenly they're going to behave better. But it makes me think of my stepsons. And when they've been inside all weekend, or they're not feeling well, so they can't go outside, and then they get bored, and their entertainment is for one to go pick on the other. My partner looked at one of our stepsons and said, go find a way to entertain himself. Like, not but 2 minutes later, we hear the two of them fighting, and yep, he found a way to entertain himself was to annoy his brother, right? So that's what it makes me think of as a way for the listening audience to think about that. If you take everything away, all the person is left with is their symptoms, and to worry about their symptoms. I mean, we all would find entertainment somehow. So that's a pretty normal experience. We like to kind of pathologize it with folks that we've locked into a jail cell.
Well, and what I've seen in my career too is most people cycle through a jail and they'll go from max custody to like a close custody down to a minimum. And then we offer the programming to the minimum custody folks. And then we oftentimes require them to be in jail for a period of time to get programming. This program catches somebody wherever they're at and moves them to this program. If they're here for 3 days or for 3 months, the goal is to manage them in time right now to make the facility safer and provide them some different things to do while they're here, but not traditionally earn it. And so most corrections programs you go to a work camp, they're minimum custody folks, earn their way there and they get a year sentence. And I kind of started thinking the people that need our help the most are the ones that are in jail the shortest period of time. And the ones that are the worst behaved, often those are the ones we need to help. Those are the ones we got to try to figure out how do we reach that person and provide them some help, not make them get minimum custody and only give programming to the people that follow all the rules and are very well behaved. Because oftentimes their disorders are what's causing the poor behavior.
I'm reminded as you told your story, Chris, one thing I learned early in my career, and it's consistent throughout, is we find that anger is an unmet need. And whether it be one of your step boys, they're frustrated and angry, usually it's trying to figure out what they need, and then you can assuage the anger. A lot of the cases here, it's really recognizing we're running a trauma-informed program with our wellness program. And that's kind of a real catchy phrase nowadays, but it really is. And in our groups where our adults in custodies are part of this program, they get to learn about coping skills as part of their learning. It's a trauma-informed wellness program as a whole, but they're talking about psychoeducation, pro-social behaviors, conflict resolution. And these are things that many of them in the program, they may have experienced it, but they never knew that it was a name for it, let alone how they can find different ways to different solutions instead of acting out the way they normally did, maybe the way that their stepdad or their parents taught them how to act out. So it's been fun and impressive. And our staff have done an amazing job in working in these housing areas as they've come along, and they've been seeing it and then engaging in it and watching the benefits of it. So it's been fun all around.
I'm wondering if you could help put a face on the program makes, the real life impact it makes for adults in custody. So I'm wondering if there are any stories that you have around how the difference in programming and interactions with someone has really changed their behavior within the jail setting.
I have a couple quick ones. There was a young lady who was here. She had some mental health issues, and she had also some developmentally disabled stuff. And at this point with the jail, we didn't have a really strong relationship with the developmentally disabled services locally. And what we've done is we've brought them on board. They have full access and they have a whole process that they use now. We've been able to get them engaged with the jail, and they were able to achieve getting her guardianship. She did go to the state hospital, but when she left the state hospital, because we had that, she went right into a foster home with some other ladies. So things that we hadn't been able to do just a few years ago by creating the relationships with our local community partners. This was a success story with a young lady who had a very bad trauma background, but because of the dedication through our command staff from the sheriff down to really just do the right thing. We talk about it all the time. What's the right thing to do? And for this young lady, it was to make sure that we put the services in front of her and then allowed that whole process so that she could be successful. It's been a couple months and she's not back and she's living her best life. And that's really, I think, the right thing to do for her.
This story highlights for me your focus on doing the right thing, not only for the adults in custody that are with you at this moment, but how you extend that at the Lane County Jail around what will happen when this person leaves our facility and the planning of that. And I know that has been a struggle for some folks. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that piece of it, the having some place to go and the planning piece for when someone leaves versus the traditional way of doing things.
Yeah, I can. As everybody probably listening knows, housing is challenging for everybody. And it's no different for people who are in custody, who are releasing, and regardless of how they're releasing, if they're coming back from the state hospital or if they're here pre-trial. And so releasing is releasing. And what we try to do through our WellPath team is we do have some release planners. We do have myself and now Sergeant J.D. Olson, and Release planning for us is critical because if we can create a warm handoff to our local partners, then we have the very best chance of reducing recidivism. So otherwise, people who simply are in their cycle, they know what they know. And so if you can disrupt that and provide them an opportunity to have a safe, warm place to go and to land, the chances go up significantly that they're going to probably be able to then take advantage of other resources. And we have sponsors locally, we have some other housing options, but again, there's always a shortage. The way that the courts work, we can go on, and many of the audience may know, but people get released for various reasons, and oftentimes it's not with very much notice. So where we can release plan, we do our very best to make sure that we set people up for success.
I remember when I started working here 27 years ago, what Sergeant Hardy just described wasn't even part of our processes. When somebody got released from jail, they just got released from jail. Criminal charges were done, they got released. There was no talk of a warm handoff or really working with other entities in the community to try to transition that person out of custody. So where we were and where we're at today is huge. I think 80% of the people that cycle through county jails never move on to prison. They cycle in and out of county jails, oftentimes with no off ramp coming back out. So starting to move in this direction is very innovative in trying to keep people from coming back or finding how do they find their way in the system and how do they find their way back out of the system. And 27 years ago, we weren't thinking like that. It was all based on criminal charges done, they go out the door. 3 days later, you'd see them come back to jail again. And typically, addiction was driving the bus on most of those folks, and their criminality was from their addictions.
It is such a good reminder, Captain Riley, around that most folks cycle back out again, that they aren't going to prison, that they are coming back into the communities, and the importance of thinking about this and intervening in a different way so we don't keep getting what we're getting. And it reminds me of some conversations you and I have had about your evolution over the years around your viewpoint on how to interact with folks within a jail setting and the kind of programming that had to happen. You've been doing this for a while. Like me, you probably don't want to get into exactly how long it's been because I don't tend to get into how long it's been. But you've been doing this for a while, and your thinking has really changed around the jail environment and how we interact with folks because you saw what was happening before wasn't working.
Yeah, what I've learned over the years is if you can connect with someone on a human level and build rapport, that's where the best opportunity for change is going to come. But it's also where the best opportunity to have a safe and more efficient, overall better work environment that work in a jail. And I'm just naturally geared like that. And so as I worked in jails, I was always kind of that human first approach to everything, which is the best way to do it. But that's where you can really connect with people. And if your programming is based around trying to connect with people at a human level, not necessarily that's the rule, you must follow it. That's when you really see people start to change and blossom and feel safe in that environment. I was going to piggyback on what Sergeant Hardy said earlier about some of the groups that go on up there. Some of the AICs in those groups have told me they've never been in a group setting like that to be able to open up and talk about some of the things that they're realizing about themselves and then some of the skills they're learning. They might not be leaving here and going to supportive housing, but they're leaving here with a skill set they never had before and never thought jail would provide them that safe place to sit in a group and realize they're like a lot of other people with a lot of similarities. And Sergeant Hardy hears more of that than I do, but it's pretty interesting to listen to folks talk about that and what they're getting out of the programming.
What an important reminder, too, that lots of folks that end up continuously in a jail setting, they've had really, really difficult, trauma-filled lives where they may have never learned skills that all of us take for granted. They maybe have never had an opportunity to feel safe and share their feelings or told that they were a good job or even told that they were loved. And highlighting what you're saying to find that in a jail environment, I think really speaks to the level of work and intervention that the jail is providing, and totally not what people think about when they think about a jail environment and what would be possible.
Well, that's kind of what I think shaped me to come up with some of the programming ideas when we were developing these, were some of the conversations I've had over the years where I've learned majority of folks that end up in the criminal justice system had some sort of traumatic things happen to them. A lot of times abuse when they were younger that led to drug addiction that eventually led to their criminality. And when you hear their stories of how they got here, a lot of those stories are horrific, and then you start to really learn about the trauma that they've gone through, which led to the addiction and then the criminality that led them into the system. And I've always thought, geez, how do we help these folks and get them back out of the system? It's that trauma informed approach to go back and deal with the undealt with trauma from probably their childhood, where they were the victim of something horrific, all the way back to the healing pieces of getting them out of the system and getting them off of substances.
I wrote down here, Chris, and this dovetails, I think, perfect with what the captain just said is, and I've said this before, but I've asked people, instead of saying, what's wrong with you? If you said, what happened to you? Those are two very different things. One of them is, it's kind of abrasive. Let's be honest. If you looked at me and said, what's wrong with you? Versus you look at somebody who we know, just as the captain indicated there, they have a huge trauma history and they've numbed themselves with drugs. And then the criminality supports their drug habit that they use to numb. It's a cycle. And if you can break that cycle, that's the thing. But how you talk with people and how you build rapport with somebody and you build trust by just simply asking somebody if they're willing to tell their story. What happened to you? That opens up all kinds of doors. And you don't have to have a degree to have a conversation and be human. And that's where, as the captain indicated, when you humanize people and you talk to people and you come with that approach, it's amazing the conversations that you can derive from that.
So many good points, Sergeant Hardy. And earlier when you said someone from a safety and security background in your multidisciplinary team, you have that as well, right?
Yes, I do. My background is I've got 24 years, and my background is a lot in alternative programs. But yes, I have a safety and security background as well. I was on our SORT team, which Sergeant J.D. Olson is a sergeant of, and I'm on our crisis negotiation team. And so I'm kind of a jack of all trades, yes.
I think this brings this home, though, for both you, Captain Riley, and you, Sergeant Hardy, is that it's the mindset of how you work with and intervene and treat people, and you don't necessarily have to have the alphabet soup behind your name in order to be able to do that, which is a different mindset that there has been traditionally within the system. And I think that's a really wonderful point. It's about how we treat people.
Absolutely. I've gone to a few conferences lately too, where I've listened to them talk about wellness programs for people in law enforcement. And what they're really talking about is the same stuff we're providing for our adults in custody. So I think as we move into the future, more and more folks are going to realize that how we take care of ourselves is how we need to take care of the people that we have in our facilities, and we'll all be healthier all around. But that trauma-informed approach is being talked about on both sides of how law enforcement should take care of themselves as well as take care of the folks you have in custody.
Captain Riley, that is beautiful bridging for what I was just thinking about. I was thinking about how, for our listening audience, corrections out of all of law enforcement has the absolute most dismal rates of self-care and what happens with self-care. Correctional officers on average die 3 years after retirement. There are high rates of suicide, divorce. It's an incredibly stressful job. And so I'm wondering, this new way of interacting with adults in custody, how has that been for staff to be able to decrease that level of hypervigilance and stress during the day and their own staff wellness?
Yeah, hopefully staff are seeing that in themselves as they start working with folks in here. I know, again, I've heard people say it throughout the years. Oftentimes, you describe someone in corrections to a T. I think myself and Sergeant Hardy are fairly healthy because of how we approach the job and how we deal with people. Doesn't put me in that doom and gloom sort of environment all the time, which is easy to go there. But I've heard people say before, it's easier to be angry than it is to be sad. And I think a lot of staff that work in correctional facilities have a lot of sympathy towards people, as you're hoping people have empathy, the sympathy is masked with anger and being mad because it's easier than being sad. But some of the folks we see in here, like we're just talking about, has a toll on the people that work in jails. And I think they distance themselves from that. And I think that's just part of being in corrections. But if you have a way to intervene and offer programs and then take care of yourself, and it's just a healthier environment all the way around, I think we'll start to see the long-term effects of people in this profession, hopefully living longer after retirement, and just overall seeing that we can make a difference in folks' lives here in the jail. Often people find themselves in the criminal justice system. We got to figure out a way to help them get back out of it. They don't have to stay here. And I think these programs are the key to doing that in the future.
It also seems that having a different environment where, like you were saying earlier, in the all lockdown unit with no windows, no lights, nothing to do, folks find ways to entertain themselves, right? And that's stressful for jail staff. Jail staff see a lot of really traumatic things. And then you have to find a way to deal with that. And you're right. It's easier to be angry about it than it is to be sad about it, because it's a lot of sadness. It's a lot to carry. It's heavy. And so I'm wondering around having a jail environment where you're having less unusual incidents, where folks are getting programming, where they are able to look outside and are interacted with differently, seeing less of those situations that negatively impact staff, and having less to carry will be more helpful for wellness for staff as well.
I think I got to let Sergeant Hardy tell the story that I've heard him talk about lately. He'll ask staff, I don't think they realize it until he asks them, how many, we call them code threes in here, but emergency calls for backup to the wellness program go on versus, and then he'll use other housing areas where we still have the disruptive folks that we're hoping to move to the wellness program living. And he'll make the connection of there's not very many calls for backup in these wellness areas, but there's still quite a few in that other area. And I see staff start to actually think about that when he brings that. I don't think they've actually thought about that until he brings it up. So I'll let him talk about it.
Well, really, the point is many of the people in the wellness program initially started in many of these areas and were disruptive. But once you transition them and you provide clear expectations, and a lot of that is effective communication, clear expectations, and they get the engagement that really any human needs and wants. And so there's a little bit more to lose when they're up there, and there's more lighting, and we talked about light switches. Cumulatively, there's more there. But when you look at the population, when they're here, they're disruptive, and we have those codes. When they're up here, not so much. What's the thing? It's what we're providing for them over here that's making it safer for them and for our staff. The key thing is, how do we safely run a facility and provide people even just a little bit, as the captain alluded to earlier? You're providing somebody with a little bit of skills that they may leave. I know that the captain and I are very familiar with and have a lot of fondness for is Nick Crapser. And he always used to tell us, what's different this time? A lot of times when people come in, he used to say that to people, what's different this time? And so you never know when you have a captive audience, when you say something and suddenly it just resonates and it sticks. It's the old spaghetti against the wall. Somebody leaves here and now they've got it. They've got just enough of a grain of sand to maybe make a difference.
I remember back the very first prison I worked at in 1989. I was right out of the academy and I worked in a maximum security prison. As I was learning, I was like everybody else that goes to work in there. I didn't know what to expect, and I was frightened and scared and not knowing what to get into. But I listened to the inmates that were in the facility, and I learned a lot from them. Imagine someone that was in a maximum security prison that was doing life, that was never getting out of there. And one of them told me one day, when you guys don't let me go to the rec yard, which was like a handball court type off of the pod, they told me, go out there at 2:00 in the afternoon and see where the sun's at and see how the sun goes into that rec yard. So every morning when you offer us recreation at 7:00 in the morning, if I get my rec yards when I'm supposed to, I'll see the sun 3 times this week. I would always take them up on those kind of things when I was new, to go out there and try to put myself in their shoes of what that might be like, because I saw the sun every day. I went home every day. But I worked with folks that didn't take the time to actually do those little things. And those little things become huge when you work in a facility like that. And that's, as I was learning my career, I always listened to the population to see what was reasonable and what wasn't, and just try to have empathy for folks and try to imagine what life might be like maneuvering through their shoes.
I think that's such a great reminder around listening to the folks that are programming impacts, and how it's really easy when you're not the person being impacted to just look at it from your point of view. But there are little things that you don't even think of, that you can just walk outside and get sun. You don't have to wait to be in this concrete rec yard at a certain part of the day in order to get sun, and how important it is to stop and listen and not just think that this person's trying to take advantage of you, that there might be a very good reason for what they're telling you, and what a difference in mindset
Mhm.
that is.
Yeah, a few years ago, we got a grant to start a medically assisted therapy program in here. And when we wrote the program, it was kind of like I described before. Most programs were 6 months in jail, minimum custody, you live in this dorm, you get the treatment. I'm like, how do we write this grant to serve the most disruptive, uncooperative person that's in our custody for 24 hours? Almost like the impossible grant to write. How do we serve that population of people? And that's what we wrote the grant for. Those are the people that need it the most. And so what we did was we said we have a nurse at intake. So when someone intakes into our facility, we ask questions to find out if they have a substance use disorder. And if they do, a referral is sent to our certified drug and alcohol counselor. And if they can, they will circle back around to that person to see if they can help them while they're in custody, or if they're getting released, can they give them a referral to someone in the community to continue the conversation. And so our grant was around being able to meet anybody wherever they're at and provide them with some sort of assistance. When we know 80% of them are going to be released from our custody within 5 days, the 20% that stay here, the grant pays for them to get on medically assisted therapy medication and get treatment if they stay in jail. And that was one of the things that we've never offered in my entire career. We know addiction is the biggest reason for someone's criminality that continues down the road, but we've never had programming in jail to deal with the addiction. And so that was one of the goals for me, was to try to get a program where we could take that barrier away. So that way somebody would have the ability to try to help themselves while they're in jail to get themselves back out of jail. That was another backwards approach to what we normally do. Otherwise, we'd have a 382 bed jail with 6 people sitting in a dormitory getting MAT programming because they're in jail. Should you have to go to jail for a year to get treatment? That's how our programs have always worked.
For our listening audience, MAT is medication to help someone deal with the cravings of their addiction, generally with narcotics. And when you help someone deal with those cravings, they're actually able to be present and engage in treatment. I mean, think about it. If you have a really bad headache and you're nauseous and you're anxious and you're hangry and you've had a really, really bad day, do you really want to sit there and talk about your feelings and be attuned to treatment? No, right? So this really helps folks be centered and be able to engage. And the other important piece about MAT is that it's been found through research that when folks are given MAT before they discharge from an incarcerated environment, they're less likely to die when they are discharged. They're less likely to use. So what will happen is that folks will be using narcotics, come into a jail environment, leave, and then use the type of narcotics that they used before, and their tolerance isn't the same because they've been locked down for a long time, and then they may overdose and pass away. So MAT keeps those cravings in check, so people are less likely to use when they leave. And so not only are you allowing folks to engage in treatment, but you're also saving lives when folks leave a corrections facility. So to Captain Riley's point, why are we asking people to sit in a jail for a year with the best behavior, where we're only reaching a handful of folks, versus finding ways to be able to say, what does this person need and how do I make it work with what they need? And who are the people who most need this? Would that be a fair way of explaining it?
Absolutely. And I think what's the benefit for the community? The number one biggest crime associated with drug addiction is property crime. Therefore, if we can get somebody off of drugs and living a drug-free life, they're not going to steal to support their drug habit which we all benefit from that. Not only does the human being benefit from not being on drugs, we have less victims in the community with crime of theft happening, where when someone's drug addicted, that is driving the bus and that's all they're thinking about is getting high and stealing to get enough money to get high again later. And they're in that cycle and they can't get out of that cycle. Even if they wanted to get out of that cycle, once you're so far into addiction, there's no way out of it. And the whole community suffers from it with the property crime. And just as you described, we're seeing more and more people dying from drug overdoses.
That's such an important connection, too, I think, for the listening audience to hear around the importance of treatment when someone is incarcerated and how that translates to public safety when someone gets out. Because I think that piece is assumed and doesn't get talked about enough within the larger community. So there can be assumption around like, why are we giving all this treatment? Why would we do that? Are we just coddling people and not realizing that intervening within a jail environment and providing treatment and engaging people in a different way and helping facilitate skill development makes folks better neighbors when they get back out and they're less likely to come back?
Well, I can say that I'm very fortunate in my career, but I was also supervisor of our community correction center. And as a work release, the analogy I've used for years is if I asked somebody to land a 747 in their backyard, nobody would live, right? You just put it in the ground. But it's amazing. You can go all over the world and watch planes take off and land all the time. If there's enough runway, like a plane, people typically, if you give them enough resources and runway, as the captain alluded to earlier, we used to just release people. There's the sidewalk. There you go. But when you can provide some resources here and then hand them resources as they leave, it's amazing what you can accomplish. Again, remembering, these are people. These are our neighbors. These are the people that live, work, and thrive in our community. Hopefully thrive, right?
Yeah. You're also seeing us use more and more of people from peer supports, which are people with similar lived backgrounds where people are actually been in facilities, been drug addicted, and now they're clean, sober, and working for agencies, helping people as they get released from jail because they've walked in their shoes before. I don't remember that 25 years ago. I don't remember any of those kind of services around. But I ask people all the time that I know that work in those programs now, that I know them from here and seeing them here throughout my career, but asking them, what could we have done 20 years ago that would have got you where you're at today back then? And they said starting to do some of the programming we have going on right now might have got them out of the system earlier, where there weren't any soft landings for any of those folks back then.
And I can echo that. I hear the exact same thing that the captain just said.
I just want to let that resonate for a minute because I think that that's so important in this journey that we're going on together as we're figuring out how to best to intervene. That, wow, if we had done some of these things back then, that would have made a huge difference for the peers you have now that are working with folks. I'm wondering if you all can talk about what kind of interventions the peers are doing with adults in custody and how hopeful it is to have someone who has walked in those shoes have a conversation with adults in custody about doing something different in their lives.
Well, I can talk about one piece of it. I'll let Chuck talk about another. I know that we have some supportive housing programs here in our community where some of the folks that are peer supports are also mentors. And they will start coming in and they'll start meeting with folks before they get released from the facility, which these are the perfect folks that we know when they're getting released, they're on a plan. We can try to get them to resources. As Chuck alluded to earlier, that's not always the case with a lot of folks that are in here, but I've seen tremendous amount of benefits from those folks being able to come in because what they're doing is they're teaching them the same trauma-informed COG skills on the outside of pro-social. How do you spend a Saturday evening sober and having pro-social environments with people that used to involve drug use or drinking, or they're teaching them how to live lives to do things pro-social and different ways to do it. And there's mentors and peers showing them how to do that. And I don't think 20 years ago we knew that that was an important piece, but think about all of us. We all have had that throughout our life somehow, some way, through parents, teachers, coaches, neighbors, family, friends. Everybody has some sort of support system around them that helps them through that. And a lot of folks that are in our system don't have those support systems. And I don't think we ever thought we needed to make sure that we connected them with those support systems. And so I'm seeing the benefit there. Even Chuck works more directly with a lot of those warm handoffs.
Yes. What we also did recently is to meet with a lot of our community support providers in scheduled meetings, weekly or monthly, provides the ability to everybody to understand the population that we are all engaged with is the same population, right? And so what we've done is we've opened it up where some of our community supportive housing and these providers, they can call the jail and they can request that if so-and-so comes in, can we notify them? And that might sound sort of, okay, what's the big deal? Well, if they're trying to get them housing and they just lost connection, this person's homeless and they moved their tent or whatever, and all they need to do is finish a signature. And if they know that Timmy or Susie, hey, they're here, they're just going to be here maybe for a day or so, then they can connect with them and then we will make a notification when they're leaving so that they can maybe finish up that paperwork and then boom. Now that causes workload for us, but in the end, it may save us tremendous amount of workload in the future if all of a sudden that person, that small connection allowed somebody to get stable housing.
The two of you are making me think of a couple things. One, to what you were speaking to, Captain Riley, not only did we all have that kind of mentorship when we were young that adults in custody may not have, but also the importance of someone who says, I've been here. I have been here and I did this and you can do this too, is so powerful. And I think we've been learning that lesson over the last couple of years, the power of peers to be able to do that. So there's not only just the community and kinship, but the power of hope.
And I don't think 20 years ago we were bringing folks from lived life experiences into the public safety world like we are now. And we missed the opportunities to make those connections because we weren't inviting them into these arenas and exploring these different ideas and options to help people.
Exactly. And Sergeant Hardy, when you were speaking, it made me think of the traditional ways of doing things is around paperwork, and if they want it bad enough, they'll get it done, which we're finding with certain populations is not a great way to engage folks. And it made me think of that with the work that you're doing and the extra work for y'all to make sure that this person is getting connected and those signatures are happening and that they have a place to land. But the payoff around engaging folks in a different way and not just expecting people to engage in the way we think they should engage if they really want help, which was the old way of looking at things.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of what the captain said earlier when we started the show is historically as a society or certainly in law enforcement, people got things if they've earned it, right? If Timmy or Susie really wanted housing, they would make sure that they connected and made sure that connection occurred. And that could be our standpoint. That could be our go-to line, right? Well, I guess they didn't really want it bad enough. Or what you do is, what's the right thing to do? Why don't we set a process up where we can make sure we all know this person, this is the small piece we need to do, and let's make sure we make that connection and not just assign fault or some negative connotation to that individual who, again, thinking of it from a trauma standpoint or from a drug addiction standpoint, they're not like maybe all of us here who are, as far as how we approach our day, we're very fortunate with coming in, we're very responsible, we're trying to get them there, but how about we not just blame them for not being there already and we try and help them get there.
I think sometimes too, we got to remember we got to meet somebody where they're at. I'll use myself as an example. Every time that I've had to earn something, which very few things in life do people not earn, I was in a very supported place. I had support systems all around me that allowed me to earn something and be the best person I could be. And I don't think we always look at exactly what Chuck just talked about right there. We want someone to be here, but do they have a roof over their head? Do they have food to eat every day? Do they have their basic needs being met? No one can ever be the best them they can be if they don't have the basic structure. And I think we forget everything we've ever earned in life we were probably in a good spot in life to be able to go out and earn that. And so I think it's crucial for us to meet someone where they're at, provide those safety nets for them of the basic hierarchy of needs, and then say, here's where we want you to be.
Such fantastic points, and what good reminders, because it's easy to have your blinders up and forget those pieces of what it's like to be supported and all the difference it makes in getting things done. So I can imagine that some folks might be listening to this podcast, other jail commanders may be listening to this podcast and think, oh, this is so great. And I'm wondering for folks who may be listening to this, well, two questions. Does it make a huge difference having all the programming there, even though you have light switches and natural light? And two, if it does make a difference to have all the programming there, how are y'all paying for that? How are you figuring that out?
Yeah, those are great questions. Yes, it does make a difference, to answer your question. And two, the Lane County Jail, the main jail we have, is 382 jail beds, and we have a sheriff's jail levy that pays for 78% of that operation. So 78% of that is paid for a levy that's coming up here at the end of May, and that levy's going back out. So that pays for a big chunk of what we do in the main jail. We have almost 400,000 people live in our community, and we have a 382 bed jail, which is not a lot of jail beds for a community our size. So we have pretrial services in our jail. We really look to figure out how to get somebody out of jail as they're coming to jail, and we only keep the folks in jail that need to be in jail. So very violent charges are the ones that are in jail. We don't have people in jail just to have people in jail in Lane County. People that are in jail have been deemed a danger to the community, and that's who we're holding in here. We have difficult to manage folks in here, and if we were to not have the jail levy, we wouldn't be able to have 382 jail beds in our community doing the things we're doing with those folks.
I think these are all really good reminders, particularly when you're talking about your jail beds. Typically, they are reserved for folks who have pretty significant charges where there is an aspect of danger to the community. And I think it's also important to remember that when you're talking about the Wellness Project, that the folks who are in that project aren't in there for light charges. They're still in there for pretty significant charges because that is who you are keeping in your jail population. And the difference that you are seeing in that wellness project for folks who have pretty significant charges, pretty significant behavioral health symptoms, and how much better they do with that programming because you are able to have this levy and be able to make services available to help intervene in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the folks that are in that program have some pretty serious charges, which goes back to when we first started the wellness program and everyone's concerns for the overall safety of the facility if we were to create a program like that. We're managing these folks better, but some of the folks that are in that program are going to prison. They are here while they're maneuvering the court system to eventually find out what their prison sentence is going to look like. We've got folks that are dangerous with serious charges in that program, but those folks are going to be in this jail pre-trial while they're going through the court process. So we got to figure out how to best manage those folks and to help them and hopefully send them to prison with some skill sets that they'll take with them and continue to build on once they get up there. Probably an important piece to talk about with the jail levy. Back in 2008, we went through serious budget cuts and we had 125 jail beds for local offenders. So that's what it looked like in 2008 without the sheriff's levy. In 2013, when we passed the levy, we promised the community 255 jail beds. That's what the jail levy promises, and we actually have 382. So we've figured out a way to get more folks in the facility than 255, but that was the levy promise. When we had 125 beds back in 2008, there were pre-trial Measure 11 crimes getting forced released out of our facility. People were coming here for serious crime, and we didn't have the capacity to hold them. The jail levy really is a big piece of keeping our community safe and having the jail beds for the folks that need to be in jail. And then we've got the systems to get people out of jail and maneuver the court system from the community for those that are appropriate.
Such important points. And it also makes me think of conversations that you and I have had before around not keeping people in jail with low charges because they have behavioral health symptoms, that jail, with all the fantastic programming that y'all are doing in jail, that your focus is on the folks who have significant charges and have symptomology, not just that someone is in public and doing something minor and then comes to the jail for treatment. So I think that's really important for folks to know too, is that we're talking about the adults in custody in the jail have significant things going on with charges and they have symptomology. That when Captain Riley was talking about they have pretty significant behavioral health and substance use, you're not keeping folks just because they have that. They have other reasons of being in the jail. I just don't want listeners to be confused by that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chris. We're going to hold everyone that comes to jail for a serious crime. And then whatever behavioral health or substance use disorders they have, we're going to manage those as well while they're here. We'll have people in our facility that are actively suicidal. And if they're here for a violent felony crime, we're working with our psychiatrists, we're working with our medical, we're going to keep that person safe while they're in here. But we deal with on a daily basis some very serious stuff because that person's charged with a crime, then they can't go back out in the community. We're equipped to deal with it inside this facility.
Also, the way that you're offering programming and interventions for meeting people where they are is that the jail does not have a choice, right? You have to take folks and you want to do the right thing for folks when they're in your custody by interviewing and providing treatment. If they end up going to prison, it means that they'll be in a much better place when they get into the Department of Corrections. And if they're coming back into the community, they're much more likely to be better neighbors when they leave your facility.
I always tell people too, think about when you watch the news, you read the newspaper, and you read about a police incident that happened in the community where an arrest was made. Whatever the result of that might be, that person's probably going to be in jail custody, potentially 1, 2, 3 years. And the jails are then going to manage that person. And so that incident doesn't necessarily stop there. It's just the beginning of managing that person. And so we've got great medical and mental health staff here. And I have seen them deal with folks that have come into our facility and they've had them in the hospital, back in the jail, back to the hospital, back to the jail, and nursed people back to health over the course of a year or two as they've transitioned into our custody. And then we manage them during that time.
It reminds me, too, that we talk a lot about behavioral health symptomology, whether that be a psychiatric diagnosis, as you were alluding to earlier, Sergeant Hardy, someone with intellectual and developmental disabilities, neurocognitive conditions like a traumatic brain injury, or substance use. And that generally is not all that adults in custody are dealing with. There's usually quite a bit of physical issues going on. There's usually a lot of, like we talked about, trauma and other issues around housing and everything else in the community. But I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, Captain Riley, I've heard that being considered elderly within a corrections or institutional environment is much lower than one would think about being elderly within the outside community, because folks are in such worse physical shape because of the hard living that they've had over the years.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. You see folks that are in our facility that shouldn't be categorized as elderly, but the abuse they've done to their own health throughout the years because of lifestyle choices. We see a very medically needy population of folks in jails.
I think the thing that most people should be aware of, and maybe many on this call are familiar, but we have to provide a community level of care. And so if somebody has an ailment or some issue that they're dealing with while in custody, we will ensure that they get the care that your family member would get, that I would expect. And so it's expensive, however, because of many of the lifestyle choices that our population that we see routinely have participated in. But as a result, we still have a requirement to make sure that they're taken care of. And there's a lot that goes into that. That would be another show, but it's expensive. But it's, again, it goes back to it's the right thing to do, and we need to make sure we do it.
For our listening audience, because I've heard this being a point of contention, is the level of medical and behavioral health care that someone receives in a jail environment or an incarcerated environment. And what I think sometimes folks don't realize is that constitutionally that is required, that you're required to do that. I think sometimes it gets painted as, why are folks getting that level of care when folks in the community can't get that level of care? And it gets missed that it is not only the right thing to do, but it is constitutionally required for jails to do that.
Yeah. And you also see a lot of folks come to jail that are not taking care of themselves. And then when they come to jail, they're in the worst physical shape they could be in. And then our medical has to start right there with the treatment of that person. And oftentimes you'll see them get right back out, not take care of themselves again, make lifestyle choices that deteriorate their health. And then they come back to custody in the same shape they were before. And you see folks cycle in and out. So you're 100% right. If we don't have that level of care, the last thing anybody wants to do in a correctional facility is lose somebody. And so we got to make sure we have those medical pieces in place to make sure we can care for anyone that comes through our door.
Absolutely. That's the last thing you want, is to lose someone or have them be worse in your care.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think gets lost too, what folks don't realize, is that when someone reaches the Department of Corrections, that care is covered under general fund, because Medicaid does not cover when someone is in an institutional environment, whether that be a state prison facility or a county jail facility. There is no insurance for folks at that point. And there is also, in a jail facility, no general fund like there is in a state facility. So the money that is required for programming and treatment for a potentially very fragile population comes out of county money, not out of state general fund or Medicaid.
Comes out of our sheriff's office budget. Yes. And I know there's a lot of talk around not only the state, but the nation of trying to do a Medicaid Reform Act that would keep people on their Medicaid. Because we talked earlier, most folks that come to our facility, a lot of them are on the Oregon Health Plan. They come off the Oregon Health Plan and go on the county medical program that we have here in the jail. If they were to stay on that Oregon Health Plan, then it would probably reduce costs all the way around for the sheriff's office, and it would make it a lot easier for that person when they got released. Their benefits wouldn't get cut off. And so that's being talked about at the state level, but also at the nationwide level of reforming that whole entire piece. Because I think people look at it as if someone that comes to a county jail is going to prison for the rest of their life, where most folks are here just for a short time out, and then they're right back in the community again.
Well, and even with prison at this point, I think it's like 98% of folks get back out again. Most people don't go to prison for the rest of their life. It is a much shorter stay than what is in the popular culture of what one thinks of about jails and prisons.
I know our DOC has done some amazing things in the past couple of years, but I think we're all looking at what you just said. 98% of the folks that we serve are coming back to the communities we live in. So while they're in our custody, we need to be doing programming with them to get them ready to come back to the communities they're from, because that's where most of them are going. And I know we're looking at that, and I know DOC has done a fantastic job of doing that same exact thing.
They have really made leaps and bounds over the years, as I know you all have.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, if Lane County Jail didn't have this levy and all the programming went away, there's lots of things you still would have to do constitutionally.
Mm-hmm.
What would end up happening? You said a lot of the money comes out of the sheriff's budget. So what does that look like? What would happen?
If the levy didn't pass, we'd be back to where, unfortunately, Sergeant Hardy and myself were here in 2008 when we went through this before. The Lane County Jail would be required to process folks in and out of a jail. Doesn't mean we'd have jail capacity to hold people, but you'd book them in, we'd fingerprint them, photograph them. That's what would be considered processing them through the system. And then back then they were force released out of here because we didn't have the jail bed capacity. So not only would we not be helping people out that are coming through our systems that benefit from our programming in here, the community would not be safe because you'd have violent offenders returning right back to the community to maneuver the court system from home with probably no conditions on them, because the courts aren't putting them on conditional release agreements. We're force releasing them due to jail capacity. And so not only would we not help the folks that come through here, the community would also not be safe because of the folks that might be going back out in the community.
It would cut your jail bed capacity as well as cut the programming that you do have in the jail.
Yes. Yeah. There's no way we could provide the care that we have right now. We would go down to what are the basic things we could provide to folks and what are the most number of jail beds we could have with the amount of general fund money we have left, which would be the funding sources would then come from county taxpayer dollars that come from the general fund, not this additional money that comes from the levy.
To add to this, we watched as the entire criminal justice system experienced after the '08, the loss of the revenues. We all experienced where the district attorneys weren't able to function, the courts weren't able to function, the treatment courts weren't able to function. The entire system relies on our jail running efficiently. And today I know we have 32 people in our jail serving a sentence. That's 10% of our population. 90% are pretrial. And so most people who serve sentences in Lane County serve it in our alternative programs, not in our jail. And we currently house as many, if not more, violent offenders as we did even 5 or 7 years ago. That commitment's there, as the captain alluded to, the commitment to 255, although we have more. A story I would tell is after '08, after the collapse, as many of us call it, I remember giving somebody in the morning their property as they were called down to book in, and the guy wouldn't take it. He was letting me know I was an idiot because he's like, I just got sentenced to 350 days by the judge yesterday. I'm not taking that. You don't know what you're doing. I said, you're absolutely right, but you're being capacity-based release right now. So he did about 18 hours on a 350-day sentence. And that's what the system looked like before we were able to pass the levy. So when you start looking at how does not having a levy pass in our community, that's some of the examples, and we could go on and on. But the goal is the renewal of this. And from the sheriff on down, we are all committed to the community support and making sure that we have the trust of the community. And that resonates throughout the sheriff's office, is to make sure that the community can trust that we are doing good work with their monies and making sure that whether it be our mental health program and helping people leave the jail better than they arrived, and holding violent offenders that should be in jail, and allowing people to keep their job and serve a sentence on the weekend who don't need to lose their job and their housing, and all the things that we try to do as we holistically look at the criminal justice system in Lane County. We're committed to all of that, and that's, I think, what most people in Lane County are really proud of as far as their sheriff's office.
I think one piece to add to that, too, is when you talk what's a Measure 11 crime. A Measure 11 crime is serious assault, kind of like attempted murder, assault 1, robbery 1. Those were being capacity-based released out of our jail in 2008. People that were charged with Measure 11 felony crime were literally getting processed in the jail and released out. That tells you where a 1-year jail sentence, who do you hold? Someone that's pre-trial on a murder or someone that's doing a 1-year sentence. We were faced back then with probably releasing both as we were trying to maneuver the system back then. And again, a community our size, I know we got a story for another day about our pre-trial program and what we do, but we're one of the few jails, I think, that when people book in, we don't keep you just because we have an empty jail bed. If you can maneuver the system from outside of our jail, that's the route the courts will take with you. If the courts feel like you should be in jail, they will keep you in jail. Having the jail space for the courts to be able to make that decision with each person that comes in here, they're a danger to the community, put them in a jail bed. This person can be out in the community. They're safe to go out there. For the community to know we have that going on here, where 20 years ago, we just fill the jail up and we just release. Now they actually have a systematic approach to who stays and who goes, and the levy allows for that space for the courts to make the best decisions they can make with these folks.
I'm looking forward to us having a more in-depth conversation about that. But I think this is important to talk about here is that with the folks that you're keeping in the jail right now that you're doing all this programming with are the people who the courts are saying really need to be in jail. And that for folks who are able to be in the community safely and be able to either, like Chuck was saying, come in on weekends or do other pieces where they're being watched. There are safety and security pieces in place. It isn't like someone's just out, but that you are able to have that kind of flexibility now that you may lose if the levy doesn't pass.
Yeah, absolutely. The levy didn't pass. I would say we'd be right back to where we were in '08, where the courts are wanting us to hold people, and we're telling them we don't have the capacity to hold them. And so that's the only time we really come into like the forced release situations. We haven't forced released a Measure 11 offender since our jail levy passed in 2013. We have jail capacity to hold the violent offenders right now. And if somebody goes out on a conditional release agreement through the courts and they violate their release agreement, we have jail beds for them to be able to put that person in jail and say, now you're going to be here instead of out in the community. Kind of like Chuck alluded to earlier, it's kind of like the ecosystem of the criminal justice system. You got to have jail beds for the courts to be able to offer people the off ramps they offer them. Conditional release agreements and ankle monitor programs, and those things are great, but you have to have the back end support for when they don't work. You can put people in jail. And the system I grew up in, for the most part, was not adequate enough to hold. And right now, we've built a system that's pretty balanced to be able to put people in the right place to be successful, and then also hold people accountable when they need to be held accountable.
If having folks in the community doesn't work, you need a plan B to hold folks accountable. And I think it's also really important for us to talk about with all the wonderful programming and interventions that you have in the wellness program and the different way that you're working with folks in jail. Accountability is still a huge part of that. So I don't want folks to hear treatment and having folks in a different environment and having some sense of control even with a light switch, that doesn't mean that there isn't accountability. You can have both. You can have treatment and accountability, that it isn't an either or prospect.
Yeah. And when we first built the socialization program, our number one fundamental rule was no violence. We're going to mix folks in here with, like we talked earlier about classifications. We're going to mix folks in here that normally wouldn't have been mixed together in the same environment, in the same room, in the same group. And so we built off the fundamental no violence, otherwise we'll shut the program down. But also when you set those expectations like Chuck talked about, people will rise to the level of the expectation you set for them. And a lot of folks in those programs have said, I've never been trusted before. No one's ever believed in me. And no one ever said, hey, here's this, and here's the expectations, and here's how you're going to manage yourself in there. That is the true accountability. It wasn't with discipline hanging over their head. It was just with basic human approach to, this is how a pro-social environment looks, and this is what's expected of you. And Chuck's probably got numerous stories of where people have removed themselves from groups and different things because they didn't want to ruin it for everybody else. That's a cognitive thinking skill, to be able to be self-aware, to remove yourself before you do something that before that maybe you would have lashed out at somebody. And now you know not to do that. And then you've probably got a coping skill that you're falling back on when things get tough. But overall, this is the expectation for the group. And I've noticed that in my career. People will become who you want them to be. If you treat them how you want that person to be, they'll usually get there. And that's kind of been our approach with the wellness program.
And they have something to lose, right? When you said that, Captain Riley, it's so beautiful that that's happening in the jail for people. And it's heartbreaking all at the same time. That would be somebody's life. So
Yeah.
not only are folks learning coping skills and learning how to interact differently, but now they have something to lose. So if you have nothing to lose, you're going to be locked in a cell with nothing, then right? But if you have something to lose, that makes a huge difference. And I think that really gets discounted when folks talk about the jail environment. If you give people enough where they have something to lose, it really motivates their behavior to do better, especially when you have heightened expectations.
Well, Chuck can probably tell you some stories, but also when you're hitting them at the human level, they don't want to let you down. You have people at that where when you're interacting with somebody where they don't want you to be disappointed in them or let you down, you're connecting with that person in a whole different level than jails traditionally connect with somebody. But I've seen Sergeant Hardy actually had to remove people from the program. And there's always a second chance. There's always another day. Nothing's forever. But I've seen people, they're literally telling him they messed up. They know what they did. They're getting moved out of the program. They don't go with a fight. We don't have to call our tactical team in. They're dealing with it like a mature adult. But he's also telling them, here's what it would take to get back again. Here's what it would take. You need to make this course adjustment to get back here again. That's just really awesome to watch that whole thing happen. What a safer way to run a jail than fighting with folks.
One example I could give you was just last week, we had one of the guys in the program, and we want to be clear, everything doesn't run smooth all the time. And so there was a few bumps in this one group, and we ended up identifying that there's just probably a number of guys that were acting foolishly, and we identified one on camera. I went up there and me and a few deputies talked with them, and I basically just said, listen, here's what's going to happen. We're not going to write you a misconduct report, but we're going to move you to the housing area across the way, and then you can be evaluated for the program again. But right now we need to make a change. I can actually write you the MR, but I'm going to treat you the way that I want you to treat everybody here when you come back. And so this is the reasonable thing to do. But you tell me what you want. I can write the MR, or we'll just move you, and then we'll look at you at the program in a little bit. I gave him the choice. And I said, and remember, in jail, you don't get many choices, but the choice is yours. And so he apologized for his behavior, accepted responsibility for it. It didn't really require, but he went to the housing area with the mindset that he could come back to the program. But that helped him when he went to the other housing area, because he knew if I go there and I act like a jerk, then maybe that's not going to bode well for me to come back to the program. So it's really managing behavior. It's managing the population in a way that makes everybody safe. Because I could go in there, another deputy could go in there and just say, ha, we got you. But they've been told their whole life, I got you, right? Their whole life, from the principals to the first time they got caught maybe stealing something, everybody's got you. And again, that's a human thing. And I'm asking him, what do you want to do? Again, in jail and prisons, as you know, Chris, you don't get a choice very often. And either choice was fine with me, but I allowed him to be part of the process.
A little procedural justice goes a long ways.
Yeah.
So for our listening audience, that's giving people voice and choice, and you have transparency about what you're doing, like Sergeant Hardy was talking about. He let him talk about it. He didn't just tell him how it was going to be. He gave him choices. He was transparent, and he knew that Sergeant Hardy had the best intentions, that he wasn't just making a random choice and punishing him, that Sergeant Hardy was looking out for him, but also giving him choices. And that goes a really long way versus coming in and saying, listen, you're getting moved. Pack up your stuff. We can do this the hard way or the easy way, right? So there's a huge difference in that kind of intervention. And then the studies have shown in procedural justice and procedural fairness that even if someone does not like the decision that's being made, even if the decision really ticks them off, they're much more likely to follow through, like Sergeant Hardy was talking about, than fighting against and rallying against the decision and making it harder on themselves. So a little procedural justice, those couple moments of, hey, let's have a conversation about this, saves that person potentially having another disciplinary report or assaulting staff, right? It saves the staff from getting assaulted. It gives that person an opportunity to come back again. And it also gives an opportunity for someone to have some space, to have some cognitive reflection on what they have done and have a conversation about that versus instantly engaging in the anger, which is completely different than what has happened before. So just that small conversation carries so much weight. It's so important that you're having those kind of conversations in the wellness center because they have ripples that we don't even see.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And a lot of folks that you see in jail have hit rock bottom. And when you meet someone that tells you they've basically given up on everything, how do you hold that person accountable you have to get back to where Chuck just described. You're dealing with that person on that level when you're dealing with someone that's been consequenced to death, and no matter where they go, it's a gotcha moment. There's no more consequences you're going to tell someone that doesn't care anymore. How do you get someone to do something and engage when they don't care anymore? Oftentimes, folks in jail, that's where they're at. They're at the lowest of the low in their life, and we've got to start building them back up. And so Chuck just described a very good way of like, you got to maintain order in a jail. You got to have rules and regulations and policies and procedures, but then you also have to figure out how to build self-esteem and self-confidence back in the folks that don't have a lot of it and haven't had a lot of it and haven't been given a lot in their life. And a lot of them have made some really poor choices in their life to get them to where they're at. So it's a difficult group of folks to be dealing with in a jail. It's fragile. That's how I would describe it.
I'm wondering if either one of you have any last stories so we can leave our listening audience with a story of success that outlines what you just talked about.
Can I tell one story that might lead into like where we're at today?
Yeah.
Again, you mentioned earlier, none of us are getting younger anymore. We had a work camp back in the early 2000s, and we both worked out there. And back then, the jail was in a different place than it is now, but we had a 100-bed work camp, and it was minimum custody. And we were trying to get that camp up to 100. A jail our size back then, we really struggled to have 100 true minimum custody folks that were out there. You had to be fully sentenced, pass a physical, and then our work camp was 45 minutes out of town in the middle of nowhere. It's a story for another day. The work camp is now a veteran's legacy, and it's a nonprofit for veterans, and retired captain from here is involved in it. And it's awesome. We worked out there. We got the population to about 70, and we couldn't get it to 100. And we made some modifications back then to start bringing out different types of people that had criminal histories, different types of folks that were higher custody statuses, different types of folks that would have never gotten a chance to go to an environment like that. We saw some of the best results from some of the people that came out there. I was a sergeant back then. I would meet with a lot of them, set expectations for when they came out. A lot of them told me, I can't believe that you gave me a chance to come out here and show you what I could do. But to have people in a work environment show us who they really were and what they were capable of doing that wasn't inside of a jail, you can only show so much in a dormitory, following the rules and doing that. When I came back years later and we started this wellness program, that was the confidence that I built off of. I'd seen it done once before. We did it for 5 years, and there's folks that people could not believe we gave a chance at the work. And back then, we gave them chainsaws, weed eaters, every kind of hand tool. And then the crew, Chuck was the crew deputy. They drove them 3 hours up in the woods in the middle of nowhere, oftentimes with no radio contact back to our dispatch, and saw some of these folks just really flourish. That's kind of what built me the confidence to start this in the jail, to know what could be done. And if we get these folks out and they get a chance to prove who they really are, that they will. We just got to give them that environment to prove it.
Yeah, and I knew many of them from the jail setting. As we moved a lot of these higher classifications out there, for probably a few minutes, I sat there, scratched my head and said, we're going to do what? And then it was like, okay, I'll try anything once. But it was remarkably successful. It would surprise you because their behavior in custody at the Lane County Jail was so different from their behavior when they're at the Forest Work Camp. And to see that, it was like the light came on even for me as a young deputy. And then it gave me an environment where I got to learn. It kind of saddens me that we don't have it anymore, but I got to learn really how to manage grown men, because you couldn't just tell somebody because I said so, or didn't you see, you forgot that I have a badge on my chest. I always dealt with people with respect, but it became more evident that if you just talk to people, you can engage people at that human level. And it was an opportunity. I'll share the quick story. I had a guy come up to me and he said, hey, I want to let you know, Mr. Hardy, that I'm getting out tomorrow. And I said, I didn't even know you're here. He said, I was just a short sanction from my PO, but I wanted to let you know, do you remember that time when I was riding shotgun in the Crummy and we were coming from Oak Ridge back to the Forest Work Camp? And he asked me if I remembered that. And I said, yeah, and we were road brushing and we chatted all the way back. And he said, yeah, he said, I wanted to let you know that I had made up my mind that my scheduled release date the day after was my birthday, and I was going to kill myself. And he said that conversation that we had, I just want to let you know you saved my life. And I remembered being very encouraging to him. That was my normal kind of thing anyways, but I remembered it. And I'll tell you, it's some one of those things that if you haven't experienced it, it's a very fruitful thing for anybody in law enforcement to experience, because you realize that sometimes just being kind, and you never know when you have a conversation with somebody, the impact that it'll have on someone. So it resonated with me. It did then, and it has throughout my career to this point. Amazing opportunities when we mentioned the Forest Work Camp.
And Chris, you mentioned it earlier. You'd have to tell us what is the dynamic of this, but Chuck just mentioned it right there. Almost everyone that worked at the work camp, most of the folks that are in our custody call us sergeant, captain, lieutenant, deputy. Most of the folks that were at the work camp called the folks out there Mr. Hard. If someone called you deputy, that probably meant they didn't have a lot of respect for you. But something about that dynamic out there, when I see people now and they call me Mr. Riley, I almost think I knew you from the work camp, right? I don't know if somebody issued that to them or what, but the inmates out there treated us different because I think we treated them in a way they've never been treated before. And it was weird. I had lots of talks with people back then, and they just thought that we were lucky or something was going on. But it was a special group of people that I worked with out there that made that place special. And hopefully a lot of people went off and were super successful. They came through those programs, and we've never seen them again. The people you never see again are the ones that probably did it right, did something for them.
I have a goofy analogy. I always talk about being a traveling farmer. And the analogy is most farmers who grow their crops, open their drapes, they drink their coffee in the morning, they stare at their success as their crops grow. As we go through in this career, even in corrections, you have those kind words, you have those conversations, and every time you just trust that you're planting a seed, but you have to walk away and trust the process. But every once in a while, we intersect with our crop. We come back across somebody who we've had a kind moment with, and you get to see the fruits of your labor, but it's scattered. I'm just a traveling farmer. So I plant seeds all over the place, and I don't get the benefit of just looking at acres and acres of crops. But if you trust the process, your crop can grow and it can be bountiful.
I love that analogy. That analogy is fantastic, Sergeant. And I think, wow, telling. And coming from corrections, right? You usually don't see the forest from the trees. You usually just see the folks that come back over and over again, and that colors your perspective. I will speak for me. It definitely colored mine. And I saw in my conversations with folks that it tended to color theirs. And what a wonderful way to think of it. And that's how I try to think of it, but it's difficult to do in those environments. What a lovely analogy of a traveling farmer and knowing that you are planting seeds that may not grow in front of you, but they may grow somewhere else later. And just because you don't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Exactly. I love that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the sign behind Chuck says it all right there, too, with you got to have that mindset to work in corrections, not to just see the doom and gloom in front of you all the time, but that mindset of coming in here, staying healthy, being the best you can be is going to help other people over there too. But that's a long journey. And I look at Chuck, someone that's been in this career for over 25 years. Most people don't stay that positive with that sort of outlook. And I think that's our goal for moving forward with this profession is how does the younger generation coming in, how do we plant that? And they are all with that mindset of staying healthy and having that outlook for others, because it'll actually make them healthier going forward and not lose their hope in mankind.
That's a great point. It really does help as far as self-care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Powerful. Sergeant Hardy, what is it that's behind you?
Yes, good point. For your audience and yourself, it's a little sign I have behind me. It says mindset is everything. Most people have seen it. It's a small lion cub looking into a puddle where it's a full-grown lion. And so it's really just trying to envision themselves as being powerful, and just mindset is everything.
Well, that really seems to be the theme of both of your work and the work at the Lane County Jail, is that mindset is everything. What a huge difference it makes in the programming that you do. I thank you both so much for joining me today. It has been a pleasure, and I love coming down and seeing y'all. Y'all are always doing something new and exciting and interesting every time I see you. So thank you for taking the time to join me today. I learned so much. I know the listening audience did as well.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
The Center Collaborative is a production of the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, a specialized division of Greater Oregon Behavioral Health Incorporated. It is produced by me, Chris Thomas, with production assistance from Patrick Kennedy. Music by Pat Mulvihill and Patrick Kennedy. Subscribe to the Center Perspective using your favorite app. To learn more about criminal justice and behavioral health integration in Oregon, visit the Center's website at ocbhji.org. You can also find us on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us. Join us next time as we chat with the experts about programs and partnerships that work within this complex and yet compelling field. Thank you for joining our conversation.